I'm Hannah Whitaker, 29 years old, and the night I became a wife, 2 chairs in the front row stayed empty no matter how many times I looked their way. The sea breeze moved the ribbons, the lights glowed like a low constellation, and the person I love waited at the end of the aisle with steady eyes. I walked toward Nathan with my grandfather's hand around mine, and my grandmother's blue stone warm against my skin. I tried not to imagine my mother smoothing a program in a different auditorium across town. I tried not to picture my father clapping for a solo I wasn't in. By the time our vows were spoken, the truth had already settled like sand after a wave. This was our beginning, and it would not include the people who taught me to say please and thank you. The photographs would travel farther than we expected, and the quiet of that garden would be followed by noise. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and if you've ever had to build your own peace when the people you loved couldn't find their way to your side, hit that like and subscribe so we can keep telling these stories together. I grew up on a quiet street in Portland, Oregon, in a beige 2-story with a patch of lawn that never seemed to stay green through August, and a swing my dad hung from the maple out back. My parents taught me to hold doors, to return what didn't belong to me, to stay for cleanup after the party. We lived by coupons, hand-me-down furniture, and a steady rhythm Sunday service, a roast that stretched into Monday, my dad whistling while he fixed whatever was loose that week. When my little sister Lily came along, the house filled with the scrape of chair legs and the soft thud of toes on wood. A taped-down square in the living room became her stage, and my mother started writing rehearsal times on the calendar in thick black marker. Most days I walked the 4 blocks to school and back, stopping to pet the same golden retriever on the corner and wave at Mrs. Bradley, who watered her roses like they were newborns. I learned to keep my grades high and my head down to finish my homework at the kitchen table while the stereo played classical pieces for Lily's next recital. When I won a blue ribbon for a speech in 10th grade, the certificate slid under the mail pile before dinner. That evening, my mother measured ribbons for Lily's hair and asked me to iron the skirt for Saturday's performance. The lesson was simple, even if nobody said it out loud: be useful, be kind, be quiet, and the house will keep turning. The first real shift was quieter than a slammed door and heavier than a sigh. It wasn't a scream, it was a shrug, the sort you can miss if you aren't listening for it. At school, I learned how markets rise and fall because of tiny changes. One whisper moving a number, one rumor tipping a line, and that was how it felt at home. Lily's world grew larger: studios uptown, scholarships to summer intensives, a new pair of shoes that ate through a paycheck. Mine stayed measured in notebooks and after-school hours at the library. My father said it was a season, just a busy stretch, and I believed him because believing him meant I could keep the ground under my feet. Then I met Nathan in the corner of the university library, both of us surrounded by too many textbooks and not enough hours. He asked if I'd share a table, and then later if I'd share a sandwich, explaining that he'd bought an extra by accident and I didn't need to pay him back. His family lived a few hours north, and when he invited me to his sister's birthday, I brought a store-bought pie and a nervous smile. The cake leaned slightly, the frosting slid in one corner, and his mother laughed so hard she had to put a hand on the counter. They sang off-key, paid attention to the small things, and made sure every person in the room was named and included. It wasn't wealth, it was warmth. The difference felt like opening a window after a long winter. I learned the weight of presence in moments with no stage at all. When I presented a small research project at a campus forum, Nathan's parents sat in the front row like it mattered as much as any diploma. After his father shook my hand and asked 3 thoughtful questions, while his mother tucked a napkin around a paper plate and pressed a cookie into it for the road. I drove home with the window cracked, the night air brisk, my heart steadying around the idea that attention can be ordinary and still holy. I didn't change my voice or my clothes to earn it. I didn't have to. But old habits don't loosen easily, and home still meant my mother tapping reminders into the group chat times, locations, costume notes, and my father replying with a thumbs up. I kept bringing casseroles to church potlucks, kept sending photos when something went right, kept waiting for a message that said, "Tell me everything." Sometimes Lily posted a clip from the Wings with a caption about living in the light, and my mother's heart icon appeared before I'd finished reading. Most days I told myself there was enough room for all of us, that love doesn't run out like a checking account. Some nights I sat on the back steps and traced the knotted boards with my thumb, listening to the hum of the refrigerator through the open window and reminding myself to breathe. What I wanted was simple to be seen without making a spectacle of it, to come to a table where my name was called without a checklist attached. Nathan asked me what I pictured when I thought about a future, and I told him it looked like a small backyard with herbs in pots, a front door that stuck in the summer, and people who showed up because they chose to. He said he could see it too, and when he held out a ring later, he did it in the same steady way he does everything like the next right step, not a performance. The plan we made fit our budget and our lives: a garden near the coast, a short guest list, long tables, and space for easy conversation. That's how the evening by the water arrived. The lights, the breeze, my grandfather's arm, and 2 empty chairs set aside, because hope is a stubborn thing. The photos moved faster than we did, carried by cousins and coworkers, commented on by neighbors who remembered the maple in our yard and the way my father used to whistle while he worked. By the time Nathan and I returned from the coast, the questions had already reached our parents' porch and the phones on their nightstand. And the first answer, the one that opens every old wound and starts the next chapter, was waiting in a single line of text sent by my mother without a question mark. The first time I noticed the world tilting toward my sister, I was 10 years old. Lily was barely 4, then a tiny thing in a pink tutu that glittered every time she spun. My mother knelt by the stereo, replaying the same piece of piano music over and over, adjusting her every movement. I stood in the doorway holding a stack of math papers I'd just aced at school, waiting for a moment when someone would look up. They never did. The applause came for Lily's little twirl, not for my test. I remember smiling anyway, because that was what good daughters did. At first I told myself it was just how things went. Lily was the baby, delicate and dreamy, and my parents adored her bright laugh. My father, Martin, would take her hand after dinner and hum while she balanced on his shoes, pretending they were gliding across a stage. My mother, Elaine, kept a folder of every photograph, every ribbon, every program that had Lily's name on it. I tried to add my school certificates to that folder once, but they disappeared after a week, tucked away somewhere behind grocery lists and bills. It wasn't that they didn't love me. It was that their world revolved around someone else's spotlight. The imbalance grew quietly, the way dust collects in corners, until one day you see the layer thick enough to write your name in. By high school, I'd stopped inviting them to my debate meets. It felt easier to pretend they were too busy than to admit they'd forgotten. When I won second place in a regional speech contest, my teacher hugged me and said I should be proud. That night at home, my mother asked if I could help iron Lily's dress for her recital the next morning. My certificate stayed on the kitchen counter, half buried under mail, until it curled at the edges from the heat of the stove. I used to think that if I worked harder, they'd notice. So I studied later, took extra classes, brought home good grades like peace offerings. Still, every conversation ended with something about Lily's next performance. "Don't forget to take photos," my mother would remind me. She loves seeing herself in print. When I graduated wearing a navy gown and a smile that hurt to hold, they waved from the bleachers. My mother's first words afterward weren't about me. "We can't stay long," she said. "Lily's audition is early tomorrow. You know how important it is." I nodded like I always did. My grandparents were the only ones who seemed to see me. Grandpa Walter with his patient eyes, and Grandma Marjorie, who always made tea the way I liked it, strong and sweet. They were steady in a way my parents never were. Before they passed, they set up a college fund for me. "For your future," Hannah Grandpa said. "Don't let anyone take it away from you." I promised I wouldn't. That promise lasted until the winter I turned 17. The fire wasn't much, just smoke from a faulty outlet near the kitchen. It stained one wall, nothing more. A few weeks later, my mother announced that the repair costs had emptied the college fund. She said it gently, the way people deliver bad news they don't plan to discuss again. My father nodded beside her, quiet as always. I believed them. I didn't question the numbers or the invoices that never appeared. I told myself keeping the family safe mattered more than any dream I had. 2 years later, during spring break from college, I found the truth. I was home for a weekend searching for an old charger in my mother's desk drawer when I found a stack of receipts. The top page bore a name I didn't expect: the New York Ballet Academy. The amount listed matched almost exactly what my grandparents had saved for me. My hands trembled as I read it, the words swimming in front of my eyes. The repairs had never happened. My future had been exchanged for Lily's tuition. I remember standing there hearing her laughter in the next room light, and careless as she practiced a spin in front of the mirror. My mother called out for me to make dinner, her voice sharp with habit. I said nothing. I folded the receipts and put them back exactly as I'd found them. That night, I lay awake until morning, realizing that the last thread of trust between us had burned away without smoke or flame. College was harder after that. I worked 2 jobs to stay afloat: cashier in the evening, server on weekends. I studied finance during the day, drawn to the comfort of numbers that didn't lie. There were nights I came home from the cafe so tired that my hands shook as I typed papers, my eyes burning from exhaustion. I stopped answering my mother's calls when she started every conversation with updates about Lily's competitions. My father sent brief texts, "Hope you're well," but never asked how I managed rent or tuition. The silence between us became a wall. There were moments when I caught myself watching other students' parents on campus, fathers dropping off care packages, mothers hugging their kids with pride. I'd look away before envy could settle in. I learned to depend on myself, to stretch every dollar, to accept that love wasn't a currency my parents traded in evenly. Still, every now and then, I'd remember Grandpa Walter's words and feel the weight of the promise I couldn't keep. One evening during my sophomore year, I ran into a friend from high school. She mentioned she'd seen my parents at a community fundraiser bragging about Lily's upcoming performance in San Francisco. "Your sister's amazing," she said. "Your mom said she's the reason the family's name is getting recognized." I smiled, but inside something hardened. It wasn't jealousy. It was the quiet ache of knowing you've been written out of your own family's story. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from my mother. The envelope was cream-colored and smelled faintly of her perfume. Inside was a clipping from the local paper, a full-page photo of Lily, mid-pose, and a short note. "Isn't she breathtaking? We're so proud." There was no mention of my grades, my new job, or even my birthday. I folded the letter once and placed it in a drawer. It stayed there for years, untouched, a symbol of what I already knew. I kept going because stopping wasn't an option. I finished my degree, accepted a position in a small firm, and started saving for a life that belonged entirely to me. I stopped sending updates home, stopped waiting for approval that would never come. The space between us stretched wider, but it felt cleaner than the closeness we used to fake. It was like living in a house after the noise fades. You can finally hear your own heartbeat. Looking back now, I realize that the fire in our kitchen wasn't what changed everything. It was what came after, the way a single lie revealed the truth beneath years of smaller ones. I had spent most of my life trying to earn a love that was always conditional. That realization didn't happen in a burst. It came slowly, one forgotten birthday, one unanswered message at a time. By the time I met Nathan, I had already stopped expecting warmth from home. But there was still a part of me that flinched every time my phone buzzed, still a small hope that maybe just once they'd remember to ask about me. I didn't know then that the next betrayal would be louder, public, and impossible to hide. I didn't know that a single photograph could undo decades of silence and expose everything they'd tried to keep behind closed doors. I met Nathan during my sophomore year, at a time when my life felt like a long stretch of gray between work shifts and night classes. It was late fall, the library nearly empty except for 2 students struggling through finance textbooks that looked thicker than phone books. He sat across from me, tapping his pencil against a notebook filled with messy equations, and smiled in that disarming, easy way that said he wasn't in a hurry to prove anything. I remember how his voice softened when he asked if I wanted to study together, like he'd noticed how heavy my shoulders felt. That small act of kindness changed the rhythm of my days. We started meeting every afternoon, sharing coffee that had gone lukewarm hours ago, and trading stories about professors who seemed allergic to small talk. Nathan wasn't like anyone I'd known. He had a steadiness about him, the kind that didn't need to fill silence with words. He asked questions because he wanted to know the answers, not because he was waiting for his turn to speak. Over time, study sessions turned into long walks back to the dorms, then dinners with friends who laughed at how easily we finished each other's sentences. The connection built slowly, one shared cup of coffee at a time. The first time he invited me home to Seattle, I hesitated. I'd never been part of a family that simply wanted to spend time together. When his mother opened the door, she hugged me before I even stepped inside. The house smelled like cinnamon and laundry detergent, and the kitchen was alive with the sound of his younger siblings arguing about frosting a cake. It wasn't fancy, just a small home filled with warmth that seemed to reach into every corner. I watched them set the table, teasing each other as they worked, and something in my chest ached with both joy and disbelief. They didn't perform for each other. They just existed side by side, and that was enough. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat on the couch staring at the crooked family photos lining the wall. Nathan came over and handed me a blanket, asking softly if I was cold. I told him I wasn't, but I couldn't find the words to explain what I felt. He sat beside me close enough that I could hear his breathing and said, "You don't have to say anything. Just know you're part of this too." I didn't realize until then how much I'd needed someone to tell me that I belonged somewhere. Back home, things hadn't changed. My mother's messages still revolved around Lily's rehearsal schedule or costume fittings. My father sent the occasional thumbs-up emoji to family updates. I tried not to mind, but it grew harder every time I saw how easily Nathan's parents showed affection. Not the grand kind, just the simple gestures that said, "We're here." When I told my mother about a small research presentation I'd been chosen to give at the university, she replied with a single line about Lily's upcoming showcase. It felt like shouting into an empty room. The presentation came a week later. I stood in front of a modest crowd in a lecture hall, my notes shaking slightly in my hands. When I looked up, I saw Nathan sitting beside his parents in the front row. His mother smiled, holding her phone like she might record every word. It wasn't about the research or the slides. It was about being seen fully and without condition. Their applause afterward felt louder than the room itself, and I held on to that sound like proof that I existed beyond someone else's shadow. After that day, something shifted inside me. I still worked long hours and studied hard, but I began to see the value of building a life separate from the one I'd left behind. Nathan and I found small ways to make ordinary days feel special. Sunday dinners on the apartment floor, short trips to the coast when we could afford the gas. He once told me, "You can't change how you were raised, but you can decide how you live now." It wasn't advice, just truth spoken gently, and I carried it with me. One night a few years later, I scrolled past one of Lily's social media posts. She was on stage, spinning in a bright costume under the spotlight, her caption glowing beneath the photo. "Some people work behind desks. Others shine on stage." Beneath it, I saw my mother's name with a red heart. The gesture seemed small, but it hit like a cold wind. For years, my parents' favoritism had been an unspoken rule, visible but never named. Now it was public, pinned for the world to see. Within hours, people began tagging me, former classmates, old neighbors, even a coworker who thought it was a harmless joke. "Guess you should start dancing," one comment read. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Nathan came into the room, saw my expression, and asked what was wrong. I handed him the phone without a word. His brow tightened as he read. "Do you want me to say something?" he asked. "Because I can't just let them treat you this way." I shook my head. The truth was, no amount of defending could undo a lifetime of imbalance. I set the phone face down on the table and sat in silence. He placed his hand over mine, steady and warm, and said nothing more. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes of every forgotten milestone, every dinner skipped, every applause I never got to hear. Each one was a drop of water filling the same glass. And this post, this careless jab dressed as pride, was the one that finally made it overflow. The next morning the comments had multiplied, but my anger hadn't. What replaced it was a strange calm, a quiet understanding that I had spent too long waiting for something that was never coming. I didn't need them to notice me anymore. I didn't need my mother's heart emoji or my father's nod. I needed peace, and peace didn't live in that house or in those screens. When I told Nathan how I felt, he listened, his expressions soft but certain. "Then stop giving them the power to decide your worth," he said. Let's start building our own." Those words settled over me like sunlight breaking through fog. For the first time in my life, I saw a path that wasn't tied to chasing their approval. I didn't know where it would lead yet, only that it would be mine. That quiet realization became the start of something new. A promise to myself that the next chapter wouldn't revolve around being seen, but around choosing who got to see me at all. I just didn't realize yet that the real test of that promise was still ahead, waiting in the single message that would determine everything that came next. The morning after I decided I no longer needed my parents' approval, the air felt different, lighter somehow, like a door had cracked open somewhere I couldn't see. Nathan and I sat at the small kitchen table in our apartment, the sunlight cutting across the floor while the coffee maker hummed in the background. He reached over, brushing his thumb across my wrist, and said, "Let's start planning the wedding." It wasn't a question. His voice carried that quiet certainty he had whenever he talked about our future. I nodded, not because I was ready to face the world, but because I knew I was finally ready to build one of my own. We decided to keep it small, a ceremony by the ocean, the kind of place where you could hear the wind before you saw the waves. I told Nathan I didn't want extravagance, just sincerity. He smiled and said that was what he loved most about me. As we looked through venues and sample menus, there was a sense of calm excitement between us, a rhythm that felt steady and right. For the first time in my life, every decision belonged to me. Still, a small part of me wondered whether my parents would care enough to ask when or where it would be. That question sat quietly in the back of my mind, waiting. One evening, while Nathan was making dinner, I stood by the window with my phone in hand, scrolling through our family group chat. The messages were the same as always, my mother reminding everyone about Lily's upcoming performance schedule, my father replying with a simple thumbs up, and Lily posting a few stage photos surrounded by comments from relatives. I stared at the screen for a long time before typing a short message. On October 14th, I have a very important event. I hope everyone can be there. It wasn't a test, though. Maybe it was. My heart pounded as I hit send, waiting for something, anything, to suggest they might ask what it was. The first response came from my mother within minutes. That night is Lily's big solo. The whole family will be at the theater to support her. That was it. No curiosity, no hesitation, no follow-up question. A few moments later, Lily added a smiling emoji and wrote, "Can't wait to have everyone there cheering for me." My father said nothing at all. The chat went quiet. I watched the typing indicator blink and disappear, then blink again, before fading for good. That silence stung more than any argument could have. Nathan came over, wiping his hands on a towel. "Did they answer?" he asked gently. I turned the phone toward him. His expression tightened as he read. Then he set the phone down and said, "At least now you know where they stand." His words weren't cruel, just matter of fact. I nodded, though the tears came anyway, quiet and hot against my skin. I had always hoped there was still a chance they might choose me even once. That hope ended with a few lines of text. That night, I lay awake listening to the soft hum of the city outside our window. I thought about every moment I'd been pushed aside, every time I'd swallowed my disappointment, and told myself they'd do better next time. Now there would be no next time. I turned toward Nathan and whispered, "I think I'm done trying." He didn't answer right away. He just pulled me close and said softly, "Then let's make this day yours. No more waiting for them." His heartbeat steadied against my back until I finally fell asleep. In the days that followed, I didn't mention the wedding again in the family chat. I let them assume my important event was something trivial, a work seminar or a charity dinner. When my mother texted privately to remind me not to overlap with Lily's performance, I simply replied, "Don't worry, that was all." For once, my silence wasn't submission. It was self-preservation. Each time I crossed another task off our wedding list, the knot in my chest loosened a little more. We picked flowers ourselves, arranged the tables, wrote our vows. Every choice carried the quiet satisfaction of doing it without their shadow hanging over us. The closer October came, the more peaceful I felt. There were no arguments about guest lists or seating charts, no criticisms about decor or menu choices. Our friends helped string lights through the garden, and Nathan's family offered to cook for the rehearsal dinner. I remember standing on the edge of the yard one evening watching the sun melt into the horizon, realizing that I hadn't felt this free in years. It wasn't the absence of my family that brought that peace. It was the absence of the weight I'd carried trying to please them. Still, a small ache lingered beneath the calm. Sometimes when the wedding planner asked if I'd like to set aside a row for my parents, I'd hesitate before shaking my head. I imagined them sitting there whispering about Lily's next show instead of watching me walk down the aisle. The thought alone was enough to remind me that their presence might have hurt more than their absence ever could. A week before the wedding, I received a final text from my mother. "Make sure you wish Lily luck that night. It's her biggest performance yet." There was no mention of me, of course. I stared at the message, a faint smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned off my phone and slipped it into a drawer. From that moment on, the day belonged entirely to me. When October 14th finally arrived, the morning light felt gentle, almost protective. The ceremony took place in Santa Barbara in a small garden overlooking the water. The air smelled faintly of lavender and sea salt, and strings of warm lights hung overhead swaying with the breeze. Our friends filled the chairs, their faces lit with quiet joy. Nathan stood under the arch waiting with the same calm steadiness he'd carried since the day we met. My grandfather Walter was the one who took my arm. At 71, his steps were slower, but his grip was strong. "Let me do this for you," he said softly. "You've waited long enough to have a moment that's yours." His words carried all the love I'd been missing, and I could hardly keep from crying. As we walked, the scent of the ocean mixed with the faint rustle of the flowers, and I realized I wasn't walking away from something anymore. I was walking toward something new. The ceremony itself was simple. No grand gestures, no long speeches, just the wind, the laughter of friends, and the steady rhythm of the waves in the distance. When Nathan and I exchanged vows, his voice broke slightly, and I felt mine do the same. For a moment, everything else, every old hurt, every absence faded into the background. What remained was peace. Afterward, under the soft glow of the lights, we danced barefoot on the grass while our guests clapped and cheered. It wasn't the kind of wedding you saw in magazines, but it was real, and it was ours. Later that evening, I slipped away from the crowd for a moment, standing at the edge of the garden to watch the waves roll in. The sky had turned a deep blue dotted with stars. Behind me, laughter drifted from the tables. I could hear my friends calling my name, but for a few quiet seconds, I let myself just breathe. I thought about my parents, about how far away they were in every sense of the word, and for the first time the thought didn't hurt. It just was. When I turned back toward the lights, Nathan was there holding out his hand. "Ready to come back?" he asked, smiling. I nodded, slipping my hand into his. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I'm ready." As we walked toward our guests, I knew that something inside me had shifted for good. The part of me that had always waited for them to show up had finally learned how to stop waiting. I didn't know it yet, but while I stood there in that garden, the world outside was already taking notice. By morning, a single photograph from our wedding would begin to spread, setting off a chain of events that none of us could have imagined. When Nathan and I woke up the morning after the wedding, sunlight filled the little cottage overlooking the Santa Barbara coast. The scent of salt and lavender drifted through the open window. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after months of planning and the rush of celebration. Nathan reached for my hand, still wearing his wedding band, and smiled. "We did it," he said softly. I smiled back, thinking that for the first time in years, the words "we did it" didn't mean survival. They meant peace. We spent a few days in Carmel by the Sea for our honeymoon, in a small rental tucked between cliffs and the shoreline. The days passed slowly. We walked along the sand in the mornings, shared coffee at roadside cafes, and spent our evenings by the fire, listening to the waves crash beyond the glass windows. I didn't check my phone. I didn't want to. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone else's approval to feel happy. A few days later, while Nathan was reading by the window, he looked up and said, "You might want to see this." His Aunt Charlotte had posted a photo from the wedding, me and Nathan standing under the archway of lights holding hands. Beneath it, she'd written a short caption, Some people choose different priorities. 7 words. Simple. But I knew how words could spread once people started to whisper. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then within hours, messages began to pour in. Old friends from Portland, former classmates, even a few neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years. The questions were always the same. Where were your parents? Why weren't they at your wedding? What happened to the Whitakers? The photo was being shared everywhere, each repost adding its own line of speculation. Some people sounded sympathetic, others were cruel, turning my wedding into a topic for gossip. It was strange watching something so intimate become public overnight. My father stayed silent, but my mother filled the silence for both of them. Calls, texts, voicemails. Her voice wavered between anger and panic. "What have you done, Hannah?" she demanded in one message. "Do you realize what people are saying? You've embarrassed this family?" Her words came fast, one after another, as though the truth spreading was somehow my fault. Lily wasn't quiet either. She sent long messages accusing me of planning everything to humiliate her. "You did it on purpose," she wrote. "You knew my performance was that night. You wanted everyone to talk about you instead of me." I read her words once, then set the phone down. Nathan watched me from across the room. "We don't have to let this ruin anything," he said. "This is our time." He reached for my phone, turned it off, and placed it in a drawer. "Let them say what they want. You've done nothing wrong." I nodded and let the device stay there. The world outside could spin however it pleased. For a little while longer, I wanted the sound of the ocean to drown it out. But the photo didn't stop spreading. Charlotte's post reached our old neighborhood. People who had watched Lily twirl on their front lawns now had opinions about why my parents weren't at the wedding. Some remembered things I'd forgotten, the time my mother skipped my graduation for a ballet recital, or when my scholarship letter sat unopened on the counter while they packed for Lily's camp. Soon the comments under the post stopped being questions and turned into statements. "Everyone knew Elaine lived through that girl's dance career," one neighbor wrote. "Guess it finally caught up to her." By the end of the week, the whispers had grown into something that couldn't be ignored. The Whitakers, the family that once loved being admired, had become a cautionary tale. And while Nathan and I were walking along the shoreline completely unaware of how quickly it was unfolding, my parents' lives back in Portland were unraveling in real time. The first one to confront them was my grandfather Walter. He'd been quiet for years, always gentle with his words, but the morning he walked into their house, his patience was gone. My father later told me what happened, though. I'd already heard pieces from neighbors. Grandpa stood in the middle of their living room leaning on his cane, his voice shaking not from age but from fury. "You failed her," he said to my father. "You let your wife and younger daughter turn this house into a stage. You missed your own child's wedding. Do you understand what you've done?" My father didn't answer. He just sat there. His hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the floor. My mother tried to defend herself, saying she hadn't known the event was a wedding that Lily's solo was too important to miss. Grandpa cut her off. "You had one question to ask. What event, Hannah?" "You didn't even do that." The word struck deep. For the first time, no one could hide behind excuses. The confrontation didn't stay private for long. People in Portland had already turned the story into a local scandal. My father's co-workers brought it up in meetings. My mother overheard whispers in the grocery store. Even the church community she'd volunteered with began to distance themselves. It was as if every neglected moment, every careless choice had been stitched into a quilt and held up for the town to see. Meanwhile, Lily's performance, the one that had mattered more than anything else, didn't go as planned. She slipped during her solo just seconds after the spotlight hit her. The fall wasn't serious, but the video captured it in full. Someone in the audience posted it online with a caption that spread faster than Charlotte's photo, "Skipped her sister's wedding to watch this." The comments were brutal. "Maybe karma wears ballet shoes," one person wrote. It was cruel, yes, but it hit closer to home than my parents wanted to admit. By the time Nathan and I returned from our honeymoon, the storm was everywhere. The video had been shared hundreds of times. My mother stopped answering her phone altogether. My father's voice, when he finally called, sounded worn. "Your grandfather came by," he said. "We talked." His words were hesitant, like each one cost him something. "He's right. We let things get out of hand." I didn't know what to say, so I told him I hoped they were both all right. He didn't answer. In Portland, the Whitaker name that once drew admiration now drew pity. My mother stopped attending community events. My father spent longer hours at work trying to avoid questions. Lily locked herself in her room, deleting her accounts after weeks of being mocked online. What had once been a family built on appearances had collapsed under its own weight. Every wall of silence, every ignored plea for attention had come back to them all at once. That night, Nathan and I sat on our porch in Seattle, the city lights shimmering across the water. I held my phone, debating whether to call them. "You don't owe them anything," Nathan said. I knew he was right, but part of me still wanted to hear their voices, not out of obligation, but to see if there was anything left to salvage. I scrolled through the unread messages from my mother, her earlier anger now replaced with fragmented apologies. Then among them, one voicemail stood out. It was my father's. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual calm. "Hannah, I'd like to see you, just the two of us, the diner you used to love, tomorrow at noon." There was a pause, then a soft exhale. "I need to make this right." I didn't know what waited for me in that small diner, but something in his tone told me the man I'd grown up with, the quiet, compliant father who always looked away, was gone. And the one who wanted to meet me was finally ready to face what silence had cost him. I arrived at the diner a few minutes before noon. It was the same small place where my father used to take me after piano lessons when I was a child, the kind of spot where the smell of coffee never really leaves the air. The same checkered tablecloths, the same chrome counter, even the same waitress behind the register who still wore her hair in a bun. I slid into a corner booth by the window and wrapped my hands around a chipped mug, trying to calm the flutter in my chest. When my father walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. His posture was stooped, his expression tired in a way I'd never seen before. He spotted me and gave a faint nod before crossing the room. The clink of his wedding ring against the tabletop sounded louder than it should have. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice rough, as if he hadn't spoken much in days. I nodded. "You said you wanted to talk." He stared down at his hands for a long moment, rubbing his thumb over the handle of his cup. "I was wrong, Hannah." I stayed silent for too long. His words came out haltingly. "Your mother, she doesn't listen to anyone when it comes to Lily. I thought if I kept the peace, everything would stay steady. But I see now that silence wasn't peace. It was cowardice." I didn't speak. I just let him continue. He sighed and looked up. "I know about the college fund, about how your grandparents meant it for you. I should have stopped her. I didn't. I let her take it for Lily's summer program." His eyes glistened, though he tried to blink the guilt away. "I've started paying it back. Little by little, I'll make sure you get every cent that was taken." I stared at him, my throat tightening. "Dad," I said quietly, "it's not about the money anymore." "I know," he said quickly, "but I have to do something tangible. I've already started therapy, real therapy, not the kind where you go once and stop showing up. I need to learn how to be better before I lose you completely." The diner was quiet, except for the sound of the coffee machine hissing behind the counter. For the first time, I saw the man he could have been all along, the one who used to fix broken things around the house without being asked. He wasn't trying to defend anyone or himself. He was simply owning what he'd done. "I appreciate that you're trying," I said finally, "but it's going to take more than words. I can't pretend none of this happened. I can't go back to being the kid who waited for you to notice." He nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight, just time. I'll show you, not tell you." When I left the diner, the air outside felt heavy, like the sky could rain at any minute. But there was something softer in that heaviness too, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he meant what he said. 2 days later, my mother texted asking to meet. I hesitated before agreeing. We chose a cafe downtown, neutral ground. When I walked in, she was already seated, her hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. Her eyes were swollen, the skin around them pale. When she saw me, she tried to smile, but it came out shaky. "Hannah," she said, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry." I sat down across from her, waiting. "I don't know what happened to me," she continued. "I thought I was helping Lily. I thought if I could make her shine, it would make the whole family proud. I never meant to hurt you." She pressed a napkin to her eyes. "You have every right to hate me. I opened my bag and pulled out a sheet of paper I had folded neatly into quarters. On it, I'd written a list of moments, dates, events, milestones she'd missed or dismissed. The high school speech contest, my graduation, my college scholarship, my birthdays. Each one had a short note beside it describing what she'd been doing instead. I placed the paper on the table between us. "I don't hate you," I said quietly, "but I need you to understand what it felt like. Every time you weren't there, it taught me something about where I stood." She stared at the paper, her tears dripping onto the ink until the words began to blur. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I can't undo it, but I'll try to do better." "I don't need promises," I said, standing. "I just need proof." I picked up my bag. "You can start by showing up for the people you've already hurt." Her voice followed me out, breaking with emotion, but I didn't turn around. For once, walking away didn't feel like surrender. It felt like peace. The final conversation came from Lily. She texted me late one evening. "We need to talk." I agreed, though. Part of me wondered if she wanted reconciliation or a fight. We met the next afternoon at a park near our old neighborhood, the same place we used to feed ducks when we were little. She arrived wearing sunglasses, her hair pulled back, her face drawn with exhaustion. "You did this on purpose," she said the moment she sat down. "You picked that day knowing it was my performance." I took a breath. "No, Lily. I picked that day because it was right for me. You and Mom made your choice not to ask." "That wasn't my fault," she scoffed, slapping her hand on the bench. "Now everyone's laughing at me. My video's all over the internet. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" "Probably," I said softly. "It's not much different from growing up invisible." Her mouth opened, but no words came. I looked at her, then not the polished dancer, but the little sister who'd never known what it was like to stand in someone else's shadow. "You love the stage, Lily," I said. "But when you live for applause, you have to be ready for silence, too. That's the price of being seen." Her eyes filled, though she blinked it away quickly. She stood up, shaking her head. "You've ruined everything," she muttered before walking off. I didn't follow. There was nothing left to fix. After those 3 conversations, I felt a kind of stillness settle over my life. My father's sincerity, my mother's regret, my sister's anger, they were all threads of the same story, finally reaching its end. I wasn't looking for closure anymore. I already had it. That night, Nathan and I talked about moving. "Seattle's close enough that we can visit your grandfather," he said, "but far enough to start fresh." I agreed. It was time. I'd spent most of my life trying to find peace in the same place that broke me. Maybe it was time to build something new somewhere else. A week later, we packed our things and drove north. The rain followed us halfway up the coast, washing the dust from the windshield. When the skyline of Seattle appeared through the mist, I felt something inside me lift. It wasn't joy exactly, it was release. As we settled into our new apartment, my father began sending small wire transfers each month with short notes attached, returning what was yours. He never missed one. My mother's messages became quieter, less desperate. Sometimes she'd share a photo of a charity event she'd attended or mention that she'd started teaching dance to underprivileged children. I replied only when her words matched her actions. Lily didn't reach out again. I heard through relatives that she'd stepped away from performing, saying she needed time. I didn't feel satisfaction or revenge, only the calm recognition that life has a way of restoring balance. Each evening, as I stood by the window of our new home, I thought about everything that had happened, the silence, the spotlight, the storm, and realized that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped needing to be chosen. I had chosen myself instead. Still, part of me wondered how long my parents' peace would last, or whether old habits would return once the gossip faded. Change, I had learned, wasn't a moment. It was a process. And the real test of their change was yet to come. Life in Seattle found its rhythm faster than I expected. The apartment Nathan and I rented overlooked the bay, and each morning began with the sound of gulls and the faint hum of ferries crossing the water. We both threw ourselves into work, he with his architectural firm, and I with the finance team that had hired me just weeks after we moved. There was something steadying about routine, about waking up to a new city where no one knew my story. Seattle didn't ask questions. It simply let us start over. As the weeks passed, I noticed small changes. My father's transfers kept coming, the notes brief but sincere, returning what was taken he'd write, or simply, "Still working on it." I never replied, but I always read them twice before closing the app. My mother, meanwhile, had begun to reach out differently. Her messages were shorter now, updates about the community center, a flyer for a fundraiser, sometimes a picture of a class she'd started teaching for children who couldn't afford lessons. There were no dramatic apologies anymore, no desperate attempts to rewrite the past. Just quiet steps, small and deliberate. I found myself hoping they would last. On evenings when the rain fell softly against the windows, I'd think about my grandfather. We spoke often, usually on Sundays. His voice always carried that calm weight I'd leaned on since childhood. He asked how work was going, whether Nathan and I had found our favorite coffee shop yet, and once in a lower tone, how my parents were holding up. I told him the truth, that they were trying in their own ways, and that was enough for now. He didn't press. Sometimes he said the trying has to come before forgiveness. One Friday afternoon, I left work early and met Nathan at the waterfront. The sky had opened up into a patchwork of pink and gray, and he was waiting with 2 paper cups of hot cider. "You've been quieter lately," he said as we walked along the pier. "You miss them," I thought about the question before answering. "I don't miss who they were," I said, "but I guess I miss what it could have been." He nodded, squeezing my hand. "You're allowed to feel both." The simplicity of it, the acceptance, was something I'd once thought impossible. Months slipped by like that, marked by the small milestones of normal life. Nathan's promotion, my firm's new client, a visit from Charlotte that filled the apartment with laughter and casserole dishes we could barely fit in the fridge. It was ordinary and gentle, the kind of happiness that grows quietly instead of bursting all at once. Then one morning in early spring, my phone buzzed with a familiar number. It was my father. "Can I call you tonight?" the message read. I agreed, unsure of what to expect. When he called, his voice sounded lighter than it had in months. "I wanted to tell you something," he began. "Your mother's been teaching dance at the community hall 3 nights a week. She turned down a job offer from a private academy." I could hear pride in his voice, the same pride that had once been reserved only for Lily. "She said it didn't feel right to charge what those families couldn't pay." He paused. "And I've been attending therapy every week, still learning how to speak up, how not to disappear into silence." I sat listening, my hand pressed to my chest. "That's good, Dad," I said quietly. "I'm glad you're both trying." For a while we talked about small things. Seattle's endless rain, his new fishing hobby, the tomato plants he'd managed not to kill this year. When the call ended, I stayed sitting on the couch, the sound of his voice echoing in my mind. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was something close. Lily, on the other hand, stayed silent. Word reached me through relatives that she'd moved out of my parents' house and was working at a small studio outside Portland. Some said she'd quit performing altogether. Others claimed she was rebuilding her career under a different name. Either way, I didn't reach out. The distance between us felt permanent now, a quiet stretch of space neither of us knew how to cross. One evening in late summer, as Nathan and I were preparing dinner, an envelope arrived with my father's handwriting. Inside was a short note and a check. The note said simply, "The last of it. I'm proud of the woman you've become." I stood at the counter holding that piece of paper for a long time, not because of the money, it was never about that, but because those few words felt like the apology he hadn't been able to say out loud. I tucked it into a drawer and poured the pasta water, letting the steam fill the room. Weeks later, Nathan and I drove back to Portland for a visit with my grandfather. The drive felt different this time, less like returning to old wounds and more like revisiting a place that no longer held power over me. When we pulled up to his house, he was waiting on the porch, cane in hand, smiling in that slow, deliberate way of his. "You look happy," he said after hugging me. "I am," I told him. And for once it was true, without a trace of hesitation. That evening, as we sat around his small kitchen table eating stew, he mentioned that my parents had been spending more time with him. "Your father helps me with groceries. Your mother drops off soup when she cooks too much. They're different," he said. I wasn't sure if different meant better, but I didn't ask. Change, I knew, was rarely tidy. When we left that night, he handed me a small box. "Your grandmother wanted you to have this someday," he said. Inside was a silver locket with a photo of the two of them taken decades ago. "She believed in second chances," he added. "I promised to take care of it." Driving back to Seattle, I stared out the window as the lights of the highway stretched into streaks. The reflection of the locket glimmered faintly against the glass. I thought about the version of myself who once waited for her parents to notice her, and how far she felt now like another person entirely. In the months that followed, my parents' progress continued quietly. My father sent the occasional update, small pieces of life shared without expectation. My mother's community classes grew, and I sometimes saw photos of her smiling among rows of little dancers in mismatched shoes. There was humility in her expression, something gentler than the woman who once measured love in applause. I didn't respond to every message, but when I did, I kept it simple, acknowledging never reopening old wounds. One chilly October afternoon, I walked home from work as the city lights flickered on one by one. The air smelled faintly of rain and roasted chestnuts from a cart near the corner. For a moment, I paused under the awning of a bookstore and looked at the street stretching ahead. It struck me that life had finally found its balance. My parents were learning accountability. Lily was facing her own silence. Nathan and I were building a life that didn't depend on anyone else's validation. That night, as we sat on the balcony wrapped in blankets, Nathan asked, "Do you think you'll ever fully forgive them?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. "Maybe someday," I said. "But for now, I'm okay, just knowing they're trying." He nodded, pulling me closer as the rain began to fall again, soft and steady. The sound mixed with the distant hum of the city, wrapping the moment in quiet contentment. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from anything or waiting for something to change. I had arrived where I needed to be. But even as peace settled around us, a part of me sensed that one final chapter still waited to be written, the one where I would decide what forgiveness truly meant, not just for them, but for myself. Winter came early that year, soft and gray over the Seattle skyline. The air carried that stillness before the holidays, when everything seems to slow down and people start to take stock of what the year has brought them. Nathan had hung a small wreath on our front door, and each morning I'd catch the faint scent of pine when I left for work. Life had finally found its balance, quiet, steady, and mine. One evening, as I sorted through the week's mail, a cream-colored envelope caught my eye. The handwriting was unmistakable, my mother's looping and elegant, just like the birthday cards she used to write when I was little. Inside was a short note, no more than a few lines. "Your father and I are hosting a small dinner after Christmas. Grandpa will be there. No pressure, but we'd love to see you." There was no plea, no guilt, just an invitation. For a long time, I stood by the counter reading it again and again, waiting for the wave of resentment that used to follow anything with her name on it. But it didn't come. That night, I showed it to Nathan. He studied it quietly before asking, "Do you want to go?" I didn't answer right away. "Part of me does," I said finally. "Part of me still wants to know what peace might look like in person." He smiled a little. "Then let's find out." A week later, we made the drive south. The closer we got to Portland, the more memories surfaced: the old streets, the maple trees that lined the neighborhood, the faint ache of what once was home. My hands were tense on the steering wheel until Nathan reached over and rested his hand on mine. "You don't owe them a performance," he said softly. "Just be yourself." I nodded, grateful for the steadiness in his voice. When we pulled up to the house, the porch light was on. My father was waiting by the door, his coat buttoned, his posture still, but not stiff. My mother stood beside him, hands clasped, her expression uncertain but open. For a moment, none of us moved. Then my grandfather's voice came from behind them, warm and firm. "Well, are you going to make her stand out there all night?" That broke the tension. We all laughed, and something in me loosened. Inside the table was set simply, no grand centerpieces, no polished display like before. Just a home-cooked meal, the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the air. My mother served the food quietly, her movements careful but unhurried. When she placed a plate in front of me, she paused. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "I didn't think you would." I met her eyes. "I almost didn't," I admitted. "But I'm glad I did." Dinner was slow, but not uncomfortable. My father asked about our life in Seattle, genuinely listening as I talked about work and the view from our apartment. My mother shared small stories from her dance classes, how one of her students had performed for her sick grandmother, how teaching had reminded her what joy looked like without an audience. There was humility in her words, a kind of quiet grace I hadn't seen in years. For the first time, it felt like a conversation instead of a competition for space. After dessert, my father brought out an old photo album, the one I'd thought had disappeared long ago. The pages held pieces of the life we'd shared before things fell apart. School projects, birthdays, a crooked paper heart, with love. "You, Dad," written in my child's handwriting. He turned a page and looked at me. "I want you to know," he said, "I'm not proud of the years I spent silent, but I'm proud of the woman you became despite them." My throat tightened. I reached across the table and took his hand. "You don't have to keep apologizing," I said. "Just keep showing up." When it was time to leave, my mother walked us to the door. The air outside was crisp, our breath visible under the porch light. "You look happy," she said, smiling gently. "I hope we can keep building from here." I hesitated before answering. "We can," I said, "but it has to stay honest." She nodded, eyes glistening. "Honest," she repeated, as if promising it to herself. The drive back to Seattle was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Nathan reached over again, lacing his fingers with mine. "You did what you came to do," he said. "You made peace on your own terms." I looked out the window at the dark stretch of highway and felt a calm I hadn't known before. He was right. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to let it define the rest of my life. In the months that followed, my parents kept their word. There were no grand gestures, just small, steady efforts. A call on my birthday, a photo of my mother's students holding a handmade banner that read, "Kindness Matters," a short message from my father saying he'd joined Grandpa for Sunday breakfast. They never asked for more than I could give, and I never offered more than I was ready for. It was enough. Now, when I think about the years that led here, the loneliness, the silence, the long climb towards self-respect, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel gratitude, because every step I took away from their approval brought me closer to my own peace. The girl who once waited for a spotlight learned that real light doesn't come from being seen. It comes from seeing yourself clearly, finally, for who you are. If you've ever had to walk away to find yourself again, know this. You didn't fail your family by choosing peace. You simply stopped mistaking their noise for love. And when you do return, you'll know exactly who you are with or without their applause. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reminded you of your own journey, take a moment to share it or just sit quietly and let yourself breathe. Sometimes that's where healing truly begins.